being here. As she said, I'm the chair for history on the East Campus, and have been there, as she said, almost working on 20 years, getting closer to 20 years. I appreciate you guys being here today. So let me just dive right in. So in 1858, on September 13th, and then September 15th, two events happened near each other, one in Illinois, one in Ohio, that seemingly had disparate issues going on, just two seemingly random type of things. There's no evidence that then hopeful Senator candidate Abraham Lincoln or Senator Douglas knew of the event in Ohio. But these two events were two events that, as you look at the road to the Civil War, were signal events that how close the country was to its final push into what we could call a great crisis, a fundamental decision, an issue that was going to impact the country. These two events happened within 2 days of each other and are the type of event that occur in a longer, deeper pattern of Anglo-American history that has moved the country from a period of great high kind of excitement, we survived something, through, in essence, a season of life, almost as the Romans would have seen it as an ancient pattern over a full lifetime, a long life of 80, 90 years, through high to crisis, to which at the end of a crisis, the country goes through, convulsion's too strong, may feel like convulsion, but a moment in which it begins to question what were its core values of the previous season. All right? So if you were here the last time I spoke, which I've had the privilege of being at the library and speak several times, we actually did the road to the Civil War, and that kind of led me in talking with the library as far as potential topics to cover, to want to say perhaps we should talk about this type of crisis, because what has been clear for many of us over the past, say, 15 or 20 years, it seems like we are in a similar time in which things seem to be unsettled, things seem to be convulsed, things that used to be central or were held in common agreement now seem to be in deep question. And when you look at the things that are going on, clearly, particularly if you are someone, say, 25 or 30 years or older, you recognize in this here the fact that there's just, like, everything's new and different. Not that new and different is bad. It's actually not necessarily bad. But that it's very, very different. And some of these things are kind of exciting, kind of change-oriented, like this is kind of neat, kind of how things work. And others are kind of crisis. It feels like, wow, this is like big. And it seems like in the past 10 years at least, perhaps the past 20, every time you turn around, it feels like, whoa, this is like systemic. I mean, this is like big. This could be altering, even when you look environmentally, perhaps, as the scientists tell us, to the question of survivability of the planet. So then you're into some really big stuff. I mean, I joke around with my students when we started this semester, of course, and the hurricane threw us off a week, so I don't know my students right now, but I joke with my students, I'm not a big science person, and I usually am telling them that so their minds can be set at ease. If they don't think they're strong history people, you don't have to be as strong in the field to pass the class. That's kind of the point I'm usually making. But then I'll jokingly say, even though I sometimes am jokingly dismissive of the science thing, I'm very well aware if all the bees die, we're really in trouble. So regardless of what you think about some of the aspects of what they tell us environmentally about Greenland or ice or heat or CO2, the bees are something I can understand because, again, simple dude, I love flowers, have flower gardens. I was working with my bees yesterday. I get to have my own bees. My wife and my children won't let me have my own bees, but they're happy bees. And I was working, and this one bee was working feverishly on a weed. And I wanted to pull the weed, but I'm like, well, just go ahead. I'll let you keep doing your thing because I love bees, because I love to eat. And so bees are a key component. And so when you look at things and you think, wow, what's going on? And particularly when you start thinking about questions about economy and environmental and leadership. And so what I want to do today is kind of talk you through how this pattern is kind of an ancient pattern that really has been seen, whether you study ancient Chinese, you can see some of the tribal peoples, the Romans, the Etruscans who were before the Romans, all kind of noticed that if you look at history and you look at kind of what's transpired in this society, and you get a far enough reach, right? So this is a key challenge for historians. You get far enough back, you can begin to see what seems to be something of a pattern. And there's some people I'll introduce you to who have written more about this. And then what we want to do today, what I want to do today, my contribution, what my little book was about, is that when you get to the end of the pattern, there are clues that can signal us. No different than, not here in Florida, because I grew up in East Tennessee. So in East Tennessee, when it gets to October, November, the leaves start coming off the tree. And even if the weather temperature hasn't necessarily changed between September and November, that signal is to you that there's something changing about the season. For good or ill, some people love winter, snow, others hate it, ice. But regardless, you know it's coming. Or, as we just lived through, they can tell us now, a couple of weeks out, that a massive storm is approaching. And you have time to prepare, or to choose not to prepare. And so when those clues begin to signal for barometric pressure, certain waves, watching high points, winds coming, circular pattern, long before we can fly hurricane hunters' planes into it to see for sure, the clues are there for us. And in my work of history for now over 30 years, there is a set of clues that I think are useful for us. So that's kind of what we're going to kind of walk our way through. And then we're going to work together. You're going to help me at the very end talk about a discernment about where we are in our time right now in 2019. Now, I wrote my book that presents these clues in 2010, 2011, and then I'm going to tell you some people who wrote some books even before that. And some of the things that I would suggest is that the pattern is accurate and useful for us. Now, some caveats before we dive all the way in. To get there, I'm going to have to explain some different aspects to you that are going to deal with things like generational groups. It's going to deal with historical moments in time. And I'm going to be skimming past a lot of this. Not because those are not important, but because those aren't the focus for today, but they play a role in what we're doing to get you to where I want you to understand something today. Does that part make sense? So there may be times when we're going and you may wish for me to stop, or you may think, wait, I'm not sure about that. By the way, it's always okay to ask questions. My students know, of course, my new students, who some of you I see today, you don't know me very well, but Ryan's here and he knows me very well. I really do want you to interrupt me, because when you think of the question is the moment to ask the question. If you wait to the end, I will hopefully have some time for Q&A at the end, but if you wait to the end, then often you forgot what you were going to ask 45 minutes ago. Okay, so it's totally fine with me if you do. But there's times when we're going to skim through some topics that in and of themselves could take an entire session. So for instance, last time I talked about the road to the Civil War, we did that for 2 full hours together. I'm going to do that in about 10 minutes, just to kind of make the point about the clues. So that's kind of where we're kind of going. Okay? Does that make sense for everybody? So let's dive in. So the question that we have in front of us, that I suggest, and others before me have suggested, is that there is a pattern. And when you look at Anglo-American history, so we start with Anglo-American history because, one, we're in the United States, and two, it allows us to kind of narrow in the factors. So we're not saying that there's not a pattern, say, in Europe, or in China, or in Africa, or in, say, a smaller nation like El Salvador, or in, say, Spanish culture. There probably is. We're not saying that there isn't. We're just keeping our focus on what we can discern most easily by looking at Anglo-American history. It helps, for good or for ill. And when I say Anglo, I'm thinking about England. So from around the 1400s, England had become one of the dominant nations in the world. And that's why today, when we look at the world today, the world is a reflection of European or Western civilization. That's not to make a commentary for better or worse compared to other civilizations, other cultures, other ways of possibly living the world. But from a historical point of view, from around 1400, Europe, which at that point was not the dominant culture, had there been some kind of a risk board game being played out, they would have been on the losing side at that moment compared to the other major civilizations. But that by the 1500s, Europe is in the ascendancy to the point that for the past 500 years, they have dominated the globe. So then, not only by talking Anglo-American history, it allows us to kind of narrow the focus in. We're also looking at what becomes the dominant culture. And within Europe, when you look at the relationship and the contest between the various civilizations of France, Spain, Germany, the Russians, the Italians, Scandinavia, and England, England wins. Again, for good or ill, I'm not saying better or best, I'm not saying it was the right thing or the way I would have wished it to be, but that's what happened. So England becomes the dominant world power, and when you look at most rankings of, say, UN nations, England's children, New Zealand, India, Canada, United States, are always in like the top 10 or 15 of all the rankings of what the UN would consider, I guess, good or best or winning. Again, I'm not saying that those places are better than the others, but just so we're all on the same page. Good? Okay. So this idea of a cycle is old. I first read about it back in the 80s when I was a student, and I read Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s The Cycles of American History. Arnold Toynbee is probably more famous for his writings in this. And then in the early 90s, I read this book called Generations by William Strauss and Neil Howe. I highly recommend it to you. Strauss and Howe were the first to take this idea of a pattern and kind of fold it out into an overarching kind of view of how we can understand not only history, but how culture morphs and changes. How cultures change is kind of, I guess I would say, the focus of my lifetime study. It wasn't what I started out with necessarily when I was in grad school, but what I've been interested in over time is what happens in cultures, whether large, so Western civilization, or whether small, like in my hometown of East Tennessee, where I grew up in a hillbilly culture, just a redneck kid. And I wore socks today just for you guys. Just a country boy. I don't like to wear shoes if I can avoid it. Right? What happens in that culture over time? Right? Again, not good or ill, just saying when you study it and you look over time, what do you see? This is something I'm fascinated by. And so what these guys begin to argue is that when you view both our current information and through the historical lens, you can see that there is actually a pattern that rolls through Anglo-American history. And they kind of connect it back to the Romans, this idea, the saeculum, which is really just a fancy Latin word for a long life or a season of time over a normal person's life, which relates out to an 80-ish set of years. Now, I want to stop there, maybe on a slide later, but just to make sure I say it to you now. What I don't want you to do is hear pattern and hear predictive to the day. All right, so a lot of people who may think, well, I don't like this pattern, I don't like the idea of a pattern, I don't like something feeling determined ahead of time. I want free will and choice and my ability to influence, which I want that too. What we want to say is that what we can observe is that generally when we consider how history is flowed out, it is in sort of an 80-ish window year of time. And if you think of traditionally the idea of a long life, and don't get confused, I think in the Middle Ages everybody died when they were in their 40s. They didn't. They had worse child death, which in actuarial tables throws off the mathematical numbers. But most people who lived through their childhood, there was a large percentage or a good percentage, a natural percentage of those who lived to be 80, 85 years old. So that's kind of that idea. And what the Romans noticed, what Toynbee noticed, what Schlesinger noticed, what Strauss and Howe noticed, what I have noticed, what most historians have noticed, is that, wow, there seems to be a moment when you look where things kind of come all the way around from everything's cool, everybody's happy, everything's great, to all of a sudden things aren't happy anymore, people aren't cool, things are struggling, and then there's some kind of an explosion. And then it repeats. Does that make sense? So, the cycle can be seen in a variety of different ways, and I like to start thinking with seasons. This isn't unique to me, by the way. So with spring, which again, here in Florida, we kind of don't get all this because our spring is different than everybody else's spring in very temperate areas like ourselves. Okay? But in general, if you think of a normal kind of idea of seasons, spring is what? The birth of new life. If you can think of this not starting in a punctiliar way, but just we're picking it up just midstream, right? Then what's preceded spring, of course, is winter. So in the cycle, what's preceded spring is the crisis. Now here's the good news. Let me just give this part now. Don't hear me talk about, wow, we may be headed to an explosive crisis, and then think doom and gloom. The reality is, even when you go back to some of the major moments in national history, or global history, so for instance, the bubonic plague is one of the best examples. Most people live through it. So as tragic as our hurricanes can be, or any of our natural disasters can be, and obviously the poor Bahamas just got beat up in a horrific way. And I hope you can find it within yourself to find some way to contribute to their restoration. Of course, Puerto Rico is still dealing with it, as is the Panhandle from the storm last year. And I think the last I heard was up to 20 people died. And obviously one death is horrific. But 20 people out of the millions who live in the Bahamas is an incredibly small number of people who died. So as bad as it was, and as from what I can see and what I have viewed on the BBC and other places showing the film, it looks really horrific. I would not want to be there necessarily. You live through it. So then, on living through it, what is the feeling? The feeling is relief. The feeling is some sense of joy, the coming of spring. Spring leads the summer. Summer is kind of the flowering in the pattern. With what Strauss and Howe noted, with something that other groups had not noticed before, which is what was most compelling to me, is why I'm a big believer in kind of their view of that pattern, to what I hold to, is that offsetting the crisis by roughly 40-ish years is a high, a spiritual high, that in American history we typically call great awakenings, and they have almost always been linked to Christianity. And that's accurate historically, but I don't want you to get trapped into liking or not liking Christianity. But just think in terms of kind of the spiritual sense of a renewal, of questioning, of seeking for purpose, seeking deeper morals, and to some degree, perhaps sometimes challenging older views from a previous time. After summer, of course, as already said, comes fall. With fall begins the decay. This is the unraveling section. And what happens is, coming out of the kind of spiritual high, you come to this moment when now people have begun to ask deeper questions about how society lives. And then that leads ultimately to a crisis. Along the way, what's happening is underneath it is there begins to emerge a philosophical divide amongst the people living as to how do we live, we might say best or well. And if you can think in those terms of how should we live, that becomes kind of core of what we're doing here. If I put all of us on a rocket to Mars, let's bring a couple of friends, and 100 of us take off to Mars. When we land there, we're on our own. We can claim whatever we want from Earth, that that's the way we should do it, but ultimately, the 100 of us are going to decide amongst ourselves what we think is best. And of course, you can just look around the room and you realize we won't all agree, but we want to survive, and it'd be pretty hard to not, it'd be pretty easy to die on Mars, at least initially, so we're really going to have to work together. So we're going to have to compromise, we're going to figure things out. We're going to come to a set of guidelines that each of us, and if one of you can't deal with it, I guess you may walk off on your own and hope you make it alone on Mars. Good luck. But there's that sense of we're all working together to try to create a best for the most of us. Sometimes this is phrased in like the common good. Sometimes you'll hear it in the flourishing of the society. But it's trying to figure out like what works for the civic structure. Does that make sense? So then, as this has happened over time, what's happening is as you go through the season, perhaps quite naturally, people begin to ask questions of what was previously held as norm. They begin to say, wait a minute, why is that the right way? Now, you can also probably imagine that what's happening is changes are happening technologically. New things are coming, like we didn't have TV once before, we didn't have radios once before, we didn't have combustion engines once before. And as new things happen, new ways of living become possible. And then, of course, as peoples move, and you have immigration, you have kind of connection, and maybe war and conquest, and new people are involved in what is the civic society, again, quite naturally, you have new opportunities or new pieces of information that are in the mix. Okay? So ultimately, once you get to winter, there's an explosion. And that's kind of where we find ourselves. It's connected to generations. This is one of the topics that we could spend 2 hours on in and of itself, and we're not going to. Generations and generational understanding becomes a key part of getting ourselves into seeing the pattern. Because what's happening is, as society is happening around the children, that is impacting how parents and society raise the children. And so if you can think about how we're moving from spring to summer to fall, each of those seasons, metaphorically, in the crisis moment, would lead the parents and the grown-ups to act differently based on what they were perceiving. And this becomes one of the key moments of kind of understanding how generations plays a role. When you study the pattern, which again, this topic is more about the clues to the crisis than the pattern itself, which could be another 2 or 3 hour conversation, or go read their book. In fact, their second book is the one that does more on the patterns, but the two are connected, and it's called The Fourth Turning. They wrote this in 1997. When you read what they wrote in 97 and 91, and I'm going to read one little clip to you, just one little bit in a minute, you won't believe they wrote it then, because you're like, there's no way. But that's how good the pattern is. The pattern has held true to at least to now.